And thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a great pleasure to be here, to be listening, and now also to be able to contribute. And so one of the things we heard this morning about the difference between a child being wanted and a child being welcomed is going to be actually the heart of my presentation. So hope it's not going to be redundant, but I see we are thinking along the same lines, and that is a good thing. So I'm just going to read. Every child, a wanted child. This is the seemingly very humanitarian slogan with which Margaret Sanger campaigned for legal contraception and abortion. One might indeed be tempted to think that the best thing that could ever happen to children is to be conceived and born to parents who were ready for them, who were looking forward to their coming, and to have everything set in place for them. The worst thing, one might suppose, that could ever happen to children is to be conceived and born to parents who are not ready for them, who have quite other problems and aspirations, and who have space for them neither in their house nor in their hearts. Some 100 years later, we can say that Sanger's humanitarian project has been a major success, at least as far as the power of conviction is concerned. In most places on planet Earth today, people are convinced that whether to have a child or not is a most personal, most private, and most serious decision, an individual decision that has no social dimension, is of little interest to the larger family, and ultimately is not even up to the couple, but only to the individual woman. Every child a wanted child. This means that every child should be conceived and born as the result of a deliberate decision on the part of the parents, or at least of the mother. In other words, every child should be a programmed child. This is the logic that most of our contemporaries have interiorized. It is a logic that made possible only with the advent of effective contraceptives and, in case these should fail, legal and hygienic abortion. I will argue that this is the logic that originally conceived artificial reproductive technologies, and that makes it so hard for people to see how anything could be wrong with these. What alternative attitude could one have with respect to giving birth to children? Until very recently, what people deliberately chose was not the actual having of children. What they chose was to get married. By choosing the married state, they also chose a mission at the service of their larger family. That means not mother, father, children, not only those, but grandfather, grandmother, the generations. You have families with family history. You have the images, the pictures of the fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers along the centuries. So, the larger family, there's a name to be passed on. And also, of course, at the service of society. To pass on the name of their fathers and to renew society by giving it new members. That was their mission. In such context, having children is not at all an individual private decision, but a mission that goes beyond the individual self, that goes beyond the couple, and that one assumes together with a state of life. This does not mean that children would have to come randomly without requiring the parents' responsibility for their numbers. It only means that the object of a deliberate choice is not the having of children, but the not having them. What requires justification is not why the couple should have children. This is justified by the mission they've assumed together with their state of life. What requires justification is why the couple should not have children. Economic hardship, poor health, literally a full house. It's a question of the burden of proof. If a couple does not contracept, the burden of proof will quite naturally always stay with, why should we not have children? Because the reasons for not having children will be the reasons that will require them to abstain from intimate marital relations, at least periodically. With the widespread use of contraceptives, the burden of proof has shifted, inasmuch as these allow people to have sex without babies without having to modify their sexual behavior. The default option becomes to use contraceptives and to have sex without ever having to think of children being conceived. To have children, one has to change one's behavior today, the default behavior. Get off the pill, not use a condom. This needs justification. The couple, or at least one member of the couple, usually the woman, start desiring to have a child and modify their default behavior. The reason for the child's coming to be, then, is the explicit desire of his or her parents to have him or her. Children are no longer seen as the fruit of their parents' marital love, a love which made the parents choose the married state, which is a state with a mission at the service of life. Children are rather seen as the product of their parents' deliberate will. And this is the case already simply through the almost universal use of contraceptives. You don't need artificial reproductive technologies for that yet. It's in his incredibly elucidating article, L'enfant du désir, the child of desire, the French philosopher and sociologist Marcel Gauchet, who as far as I know is not necessarily a devout Catholic, I don't know if he's baptized, but he's not now a church philosopher, if you want. Marcel Gauchet points out how this change of perspective amounts to a true anthropological revolution. In his essay, he refers to ART. He never refers to art, and yet the whole essay does nothing but describe its profoundest logic. He writes, "The child in our day and age is no longer the random fruit of sexuality whose legitimate context is given by marriage. He or she is the result of an expressed desire, which is different from sexual desire and consciously directed at the conception of a being, independently from any legal context of reference. One is no longer content to have a child, one makes a child, and there are only legitimate children inasmuch as they are legitimated by a desire to having them." So the new legitimacy is parents' desire to have the children, not the married state. But did your parents or your mother desire you? ARTs are the most perfect expression of this new attitude. Yet this attitude is not limited to ARTs, but due to contraception has become almost universal. Today the child has become the result of a deliberate desire. And here, also in what follows, I take this desire in the sense of this wanting, this grasping, this not simply a wish, or wouldn't it be nice, and I have this desire to have a child, but a grasping, constructing desire. Given that today desire has become the foundation of rights, some already begin to claim a right to having a child because they have a desire for a child, independent of whether they are married or not, whether they are in a relationship with another person or not, whether they are in a relationship with a person of the opposite sex or of the same sex. By replacing nature by technology, ARTs allow all these people to have their desires and their rights come true and be fulfilled. Some may argue that indeed we are fortunate to live in our day and age where people no longer come about by the chance contingencies of nature, but by the deliberate programming of human reason. And why should we insist on the sacredness and inviolability of nature? Doesn't nature herself make many mistakes? Isn't it precisely against nature that human persons have to affirm themselves? You think of the conquest of America, of the the West or the Western boundary. Americans had to fight nature. We still have to do that today also. Isn't the whole point of the medical science to fix nature's mistakes and shortcomings? In what follows, we want to argue that what is at stake here is not so much the question of sacralizing nature. Rather, what is at stake is this. When ARTs replace nature, programming takes the place of contingency. However, the contingency of the human person's beginning is of crucial importance for his or her dignity. We want to make the case that our contingent beginning is the ground of our equality as human beings, and that a being that is worthy of unconditional respect must never be brought into being conditionally, which would, however, precisely be the case when the principle of its coming to be is its parents' desire. To begin with, we can have a look at the Vatican instruction Donum Vitae, whose claim is exactly this. The substitution of the person's contingent beginning by technological domination results in an unjust inequality between the parents and their children. We read, quote, homologous IVF and ET is brought about outside the bodies of the couple through actions of third parties, whose competence and technical activity determine the success of the procedures. Such fertilization entrusts the life and identity of the embryo into the power of doctors and biologists and establishes a domination of technology over the origin and destiny of the human person. Such a relationship of dominion is in itself contrary to the dignity and equality that must be common to parents and children, end of quote. And I think what Donum Vitae says here of in vitro fertilization counts for all RATs. But how exactly does this element of inequality enter the relationship between parents and children? Why is this technological dominion or domination contrary to the dignity and equality that must be common to parents and children? Why is this a source of injustice and of unjust inequality? To see how artificial procreation is an act of injustice toward the children thus conceived, we will examine the parent-child relationship and argue that the question of whether children are conceived naturally or artificially makes a big difference for the very nature of that relationship. To understand the difference in the parent-child relationship in the two cases, Robert Spemann and Martin Ronheimer, in two essays that proceed along the same lines, suggest that it is helpful to look at the difference in the way the child results from natural intercourse versus artificial procreation. We have reason to say that the child who is conceived during the conjugal act is the fruit of an act of love, comes to the parents as a gift. In the words of Gabriel Marcel, he or she, the child, that is, no more belongs to us than we do to ourselves. Or as Livio Melina puts it, the child is a guest who comes from afar, whom one can welcome properly only when recognizing the unexpected and gratuitous initiative of another. The child is welcomed. The parents may in fact hope to conceive a child during the conjugal act, but at least so long as the spouses choose to perform this act with the right attitude, it is always more than an act of human generation. It is an act of spousal love that spouses would perform and could rightly perform also if they knew that they were sterile. All that is required is that they do not deliberately hinder it from being fruitful. That is, they need an intentional openness to new life, but they do not always need directly to intend to procreate new life. Children conceived by the loving union of their parents can thus consider themselves the fruit of their parents' love. I still remember until today, when I was about 5 years old, about this tall, I don't know. I asked my mother, "Dear Mama, where do I come from?" We all do at some point. And what my mother said was simply this: well, you are because your father and I have loved each other or love each other. Your father and I love each other. That's why you are. I said, oh, really? Thank you. I was happy with the explanation. Well, later they explained to me more details. But for the time being, that was a sufficient answer, and maybe the most profound answer that my mother could have given me. So, yes. So children are the fruit of their parents' love, and not their product. So these children can say that they are because their parents loved each other. Should they ever find themselves in an existential crisis, loathing their own lives, and ask their parents, "Why did you make me?" The parents would not be obliged to give any account. Robert Spemann puts it this way: the children came to be while they, that is the parents, were doing something else. And yes, maybe the parents were delighted at their children's coming to be, and maybe they were hoping for their coming to be. But what they were doing when they did come to be was not producing another human being. So you ask the spouses, what are you doing? They're saying, well, we're expressing our love to each other. They're not saying, well, we are just making another human being. We're not making, we say we make children, but that already is an expression of a somewhat mistaken conception. So the act of conjugal intimacy is not making children. They were performing an act of spousal love. These parents do not owe their children any existential account for their being, nor do the children owe their being to the causal volition of their parents. They are the fruit of their parents' love, not the product of their making. Also, today we talked about the substitution of acting and substituting acting. David was speaking about this. And this is exactly the case. The child, as a fruit of love, is the byproduct of an action. In artificial reproductive technologies, the child becomes the product of a making. So let's look at artificial procreation. Things are different here. What is directly and exclusively intended in the act of artificial procreation is precisely the coming to be of a new human being. Here, the children could not possibly be thought of as the fruit of some other activity, but they are precisely the exclusively intended product of that activity, that is, the procedures involved in artificial procreation. If attempts at in vitro fertilization, for instance, and embryonic transfer repeatedly failed to achieve pregnancy, the woman would eventually stop submitting herself to this procedure. The procedure makes sense only insofar as it may lead to a pregnancy. Let's imagine a woman going to a fertility clinic and has 10 tries, 10 attempts, and doesn't work. At some point, after 15 attempts, she still comes, and the doctor says, well, didn't you get it? It doesn't work. And she says, well, I love it for itself. I just enjoy it. What can you imagine? No woman would ever do that. It is a highly unpleasant experience from what I hear. So this activity is justified only by the end, only by the product that people hope to achieve. This activity, it is an activity. The activity of artificial procreation, the acts involved in that, quite evidently are solely a means to this end, to achieve the making of a child. If it fails to achieve a pregnancy, the woman will abandon it. The child conceived by means of this procedure is the product of a technological intervention, not the fruit of the mutual self-giving of the spouses. This is precisely the reason why Donum Vitae calls this procedure illicit. Citation again. In reality, the origin of a human person is the result of an act of giving. The one conceived must be the fruit of his parents' love. He cannot be desired or conceived as the product of an intervention of medical or biological techniques. That would be equivalent to reducing him to an object of scientific technology. End of citation. Now, imagine. Children born after artificial procreation come to their parents and say, Mama, Papa, why am I? The response could not possibly be because we loved each other, but only because we wanted you, or because your mother wanted you. The children's existence as the product of a technological intervention comes to be dependent on their parents' will in an existential way. To say it with Ronheimer, quote, the goodness of the new human life is made dependent in the act of the decision for IVF and in the acts that effect the procedure on its being desired, end of quote. The children born of artificial procreation are only because their parents wanted them. Had they not wanted them, the parents would not have done what they did. This existential dependence on the will of other human beings, however, violates the fundamental equality of human beings. Such a dependence is bearable only in the front of God, but not in front of other human beings. When I see my life before God, I can say, I am because I am loved. I am because God wanted me and desired me. This is not only bearable, it is reassuring. We know that God does not make mistakes, and we know that he does not change his mind. But before other people, we do not want to say, I am because you desired me. What if they ceased desiring me? What if they were to say that they made a mistake? They wanted a girl, but I'm a boy. They wanted someone smart, but I'm not so smart. They wanted someone tall, and I'm short, or whatever. What if they were to say they made a mistake? What if I do not live up to their expectations? Gabriel Marcel warns us that fatherhood degenerates as soon as it is subordinated to definitively specified purposes, such as the satisfaction of ambition through the medium of the child treated as a mere means to an end. End of citation. By the very logic of ART, the child is treated as a means to an end, namely the satisfaction of his or her parents' desires. In fact, for Marcel Gauchet, whom I cited in the beginning, the desired child is also by definition the rejected child. I think this is something we can also, we have to insist on. I think it's profoundly true. I think we can show that in our argumentation with people. The wanted child, the desired child, is at the same time the rejected child. Why? Because for him, there will be many, Gauchet. For Gauchet, there will be many children who will derive from this relation with their parents' desire an inextinguishable doubt, an irremediable uncertainty about themselves. Am I really the person that my parents desired? Am I really the one they were hoping I was going to be? End of citation. Their parents' desire, the parents' will to make them always contains within it an implicit expectation, and if it is only the vague expectation to fulfill someone else's desires. But we do not want our lives to be the function of this desire. I don't want the justification, the reason for my being, to be the function of someone else's desire, of the fulfillment of someone else's desires. If we want to feel loved and desired for the very fact that we are, and for whoever we happen to be. If children conceived in vitro one day were to ask their parents for the reasons of their perhaps miserable existence, their parents, just not by reason of being conceived in vitro, but say they happen to have a miserable life, and they say, why am I? Their parents would owe them, in fact, an account, because these children came to be not only by the simple wish of their parents, but by their will to have this wish come true at any cost. For this will, they have to render them an account. But human beings cannot give an account for the existence of other human beings. The very idea of human dignity means that human life is something to be respected unconditionally. We cannot give criteria for the justification of human life. Intelligence, beauty, health. No, there's no justification. Human life is justified, it is precious because it is. If we had to give criteria for its justification, for instance, the parent's desire, we would make human life conditional on these criteria and hence violate its dignity, since having dignity precisely means being worthy of unconditional respect and recognition. A being that is worthy of unconditional respect must not be forced into being, not be forced into existence as the product of a technician's making and conditional on the parent's desire. No, such a being can only be received as a gift, as the fruit of the parents' mutual self-giving, and conditional only on God's will to call him or her into being. Of course, parents are always struggling with the expectations they have of their children. That belongs, I suppose, it belongs to being a parent to have expectations for your children. They have desires and hopes for them. They are ambitious for them. And while hopes, dreams, and ambitions have a rightful place in parenting, they do so only inasmuch as they remain reconcilable with what Maureen Juncker-Kenny calls the foremost pedagogical quality, and that is to be able to control one's own projections. Or to put it in biblical terms, the principle to guide healthy parenting is, "Thou shalt not make an image of me." To allow the child to have an open future, to discover the child's destiny together with the child, but not to have the child's life planned out for him before he's even conceived. ARTs make of one's projections, and if it be only the projection that the child will somehow fulfill one's desires, the very principle, the beginning of the child's existence. Evidently, this does not mean that for parents and children in this situation, everything will be lost. Parents may still learn to love and accept their artificially conceived children unconditionally once they are there. But this can only happen on the basis of a metanoia, a rethinking, a turning away from the principle that made them artificially produce their child. What will happen if, as a society, we do not live through this metanoia, this change of heart, but allow the logic of ARTs to be spelled out to the end? The first thing that will happen, according to this logic, is evidently an ever better efficiency in making our children according to our desires. As Gaucher puts it, from the child of desire to the child the way I desire him or her, the road is one. Embryo selection and genetic enhancement are not procedures that are simply juxtaposed to the logic of ART, but belong to it inherently, which is why it will be difficult for any legislation to allow for ART, but to say no to eugenic practices or to enhancement procedures. The child whose reason for being is solely with his parents' desire will logically turn out to be a designer baby. Jürgen Habermas rightly questions to what extent a genetically modified person can still consider himself, he calls it, the undivided author of his own life, since he owes important facts of his physical constitution to the decision of others, whom he could always blame and whose intentions for him are as it were incarnated in his body. It may be obvious to us now that whatever Habermas says about genetic enhancement in his booklet, The Future of Human Nature, which I would really recommend to you, it's a wonderful book by someone belonging to the liberal tradition. He's a neo-Kantian liberal thinker, but this booklet is really helpful. He presents a very helpful argument. An argument that he directs against genetic enhancement, and which I say one can easily use against artificial reproductive technologies. What is the same here? The parent's desire is the guiding principle of both enhancement and ART. The same holds true for savior siblings. Here the underlying logic is made most explicit. By definition, savior siblings are not wanted for their own sakes, but for the sake of a sick brother or sister for whom they are meant to provide material needed for a cure. We may put it bluntly. One of the main problems with artificial procreation is that every child thus conceived is reduced to the status of savior sibling, even if he or she does not have an ill brother or sister. It is her or his parents she or he has come to save them from the consequences of their infertility, to heal their unfulfilled desire for a child. Once we get more and more used to the idea that human life is something to be programmed, human cloning will sooner or later lose the repugnance we still associate with it. In any case, creating clones of strong, healthy, intelligent, and successful people, if this is what we want to create, would seem to be a much more efficient and reliable way of controlling the beginning of human life than our feeble attempts to influence the genetic lottery by complicated and unreliable techniques of genetic modification. Finally, and this is my last sheet, okay. Take heart. Okay. Finally, if we program the beginning of human life, if RAT replaces nature and technology replaces chance, the moment that we come to be, why then should we, as enlightened, autonomous, and responsible agents, leave the moment of our passing to the chance of nature? If the beginning is programmed, why not also program the end? The logic of ART is human life is something human beings need to dominate. The promising result of this logic would then not only be a good birth, but also a good death. Thus, to our mind, the logic of ART, if spelled out to the end, may even lead to a widespread acceptance of euthanasia. If what governs people's entry into life is human controlling and programming desire, why should the same desire not also govern people's exit from this life? And also we heard this morning, it is if the desire for the child governs its coming to be, there is no reason why an undesired child shouldn't be aborted. Same logic. What can we do if we do not think this new world to be brave? Perhaps the notion that the contingency of the beginning is the foundation of novelty and the basis of human equality may still find echo in the hearts and minds of our contemporaries. We should do the best we can to help them understand that we simply cannot make new human beings, forcing them into the mold of our old ideas, and that the contingency of the beginning alone guarantees authentic newness and equality, so that not one generation dominates the new generation, a master generation dominating the following generations. But there's authentic equality, that the present generation doesn't mold the new generation according to its own image as it wants it, but allows the new generation to be new. Only the contingency of the beginning guarantees authentic newness and equality, and that our attempts at programming and planning humanity on the basis of our momentary desires and limited lights will have consequences by far more devastating than the former communist countries' attempt at programming and planning the economy. We cannot even plan and program the economy. If we do, it ends up with disaster. Okay? Now, why do we want to program humanity? Why do we think that has the prospect of success? And this is also, one can talk to liberals about that. You're for an absolutely free market. Okay? Allow new people to be new, and not to be made in the mold of the present generation. Indeed, for Hannah Arendt, the contingency of birth is nothing less than the miracle that saves the world. We read, and with this I finish, the miracle that saves the world, the realm of human affairs, from its normal, natural ruin, Arendt says, is ultimately the fact of natality, in which the faculty of action is ontologically rooted. It is, in other words, the birth of new men and the new beginning, the action they are capable of by virtue of being born. And this birth is a new beginning. It's not a birth programmed and planned. Only the full experience of this capacity, the capacity for action, can bestow upon human affairs faith and hope. It is this faith in and hope for the world that found perhaps its most glorious and most succinct expression in the few words with which the Gospel announced their glad tidings: a child has been born unto us. Thank you for your attention.